Model engineering for beginners. If you just started out in this hobby, some jobs will often not go as planned, as you're about to see. Once upon a time, I was also a beginner, and 45 years later, I sometimes get it wrong. In this case, though, it was definitely not my fault. I am about to make a valve rod for a Stuart Victoria that I'm building. This is part of a series that I made for my Patreon supporters. However, this episode will be public under the heading Model Engineering for Beginners. What I have to do is thread the valve spindle. One end of the rod has to fit into this part, and the other end of the rod has a plain shank turned part of the way down it, and then a threaded part which screws into the drive block to operate the slide valve. Using a felt tip pen, I've made a mark on the end of the piece of metal, which by the way is 1/8 of an inch diameter bar, and here I'm threading one end of it part of the way down. I'm using a brand new 5BA die. I'm in my smaller workshop, and a while back I bought some taps and dies to duplicate the ones in the workshop, so I didn't have to keep going back and forth and leaving bits in each workshop. I'm not using a tailstock die holder, I'm using a standard die holder. I tend to use these because I can preload them and adjust them to cut perfect threads. I use the tailstock chuck to keep everything square and in line. And normally this works without event, but this time I was surprised to find that the 5BA thread that I'd just cut was a bit tight in the fitting. And I know the fitting's okay because a 5BA bolt screws into that perfectly, as shown at the beginning of the episode. I closed the die slightly by unscrewing the centre bolt and tightening the two outer ones to close the gap. And then, very carefully, I recut the thread. And now I should end up with a perfect 5BA thread, but this is not the case, it's still very tight. So what's going on here? I even read what it said on the die, and it said 5BA, but it was still tight. I could screw it into the fitting by using force, which indeed I did, but the thread is far too tight in the fitting. Now I knew this was going to be a disaster, I started to do things wrong on purpose. This is very bad marking out. But it will suffice for the part that I'm making, which is not going to work. First of all, I shorten the shaft to the correct length, according to the drawing. And here I'm checking the dimension using a steel rule. The end part of this shaft is just a guide that goes into a hole inside the steam chest, so it's not threaded. If you watch this sequence very closely, you will see that as I pull the tool back towards the beginning, it starts to cut the shaft again. That's because the shaft itself moves away from the tool, as you can see when I start to cut. Just watch it. It moves slightly away from the tool. This is not a good way to turn a small shaft. Ideally, you could start off with a much longer piece of the shaft, centre drill the end, put the live centre in, and then use something like a parting tool to make it even all the way down. I'm not going to do this. This part I'm working on is going to be scrap. Eventually, by going back and forth many times, the diameter of the shaft eventually became 3/32 of an inch. The reason for doing this is that this part of the shaft fits into a hole in the steam chest inside to act as a guide, and the diameter of this part of the shaft allows the fitting of the slide valve drive block, which is threaded 4BA. And now for the main threading job. The next 1/2 inch of the valve rod needs to be threaded 5BA to screw into the drive block which operates the slide valve. I'm threading this part manually, but I'm withdrawing the die using power. And as with the thread on the other end of the valve spindle, this does not look right. The shape of the thread looks distorted, or is it a pitch problem? I really don't know, but it's not working. As I've shown previously, this is a commercially manufactured 5BA bolt screwed into the valve spindle drive block at the other end. The good news is, when I check the turned end of the rod and the threaded part of the rod, the length is correct. I managed to screw a brass nut onto the thread that I'd cut using this die, and as I did this I noticed there was something wrong. There was swarf coming out of the brass nut, and when I tried to fit a steel nut, the shaft snapped in half. That's how wrong the thread was. I'm quite puzzled by this. There's a first time for everything. The problem is definitely with the die. This is the manufacturer's name, Riso. I would avoid these if possible. I really do try and avoid buying rubbish, but just now and again some gets through, and it wasn't off eBay. It was bought from a well-known tool seller. Even with the die closed up, when I insert a 5BA bolt, it's a rattle fit. As a last resort, I really did tighten the die to close it even further and rethreaded the shaft, which by now was broken anyway. Here is the final adjustment, and I took another test cut, but this time on a piece of stainless steel, and it was no different. It was totally wrong. Even my calibrated eye spotted it. It was just wrong. It wasn't a pitch problem, it wasn't a diameter problem, it was a combination of the two. It was almost the wrong thread. Today I will make another valve spindle for the series How to Build a Model Steam Engine. This rubbish die is now in the bin. I'm going to go into the main workshop and look for another 5BA die that actually works. That's it for this episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my main Steam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.